By the turn of the century, schools had been established in the area. Later, Frederick and Dorothy Knipe, the first Anglo-Americans to actually buy land in the Rincon Valley, built a one-room schoolhouse for the community on the Bar F.K. Ranch. Many of the children's family names in this 1935 photo are those of the early settlers. More settlers from Mexico arrived in the early 1900s, many of them Yaqui and Mayo, avoiding extermination or deportation at best by Mexican troops. Among those who came were Cristobal Valenzuela, Fermín Cruz, and Andrea Maria Salcido. These few filed for homesteads. Most did not. Others worked as gauchos for local ranchers. Some of them owned their own herds as well. Here, vaqueros braid rope out of horsehair on the Tanque Verde Ranch. You can see the Saguaro forest in the background. The first wave of homesteaders were obliged to grow crops to satisfy the demands of government land grants. But even after those requirements were removed, most families farmed their own provisions. A few continued to grow crops for sale. In the lower Tanque Verde Valley, families raised corn, beans, and squashes, like the Hohokam before them, irrigating with water from the creek. In an interview in 1996, Antonio Cordova related these memories from his early 20th century childhood in Tanque Verde Valley. We had a few cattle, but mostly we farmed. We planted barley, chile, squash, watermelons, corn, tomatoes, beans, and even a little wheat. With the money that we made selling vegetables in town, my father would buy provisions: salt, sugar, wooden buckets of lard, flour, rice, kerosene, and bolts of cloth. We would go to town about every 6 months, and when we returned, we wouldn't think about town until the next harvest. It was an interesting life because it was very rustic, and we were so independent. This grocery store was owned by Jose Maria Mariscal, who also had a cattle ranch in the Rincon Valley in the 1890s and early 1900s. It is likely that beef from East Side ranches was sold here, and local produce as well. In the late 1880s, Miguel Escalante managed cattle for Jose Maria Mariscal, the owner of the store we just saw. The Escalante family, homesteaders in the Rincon Valley, also lived independently on the land. Because arid land was not conducive to agriculture, ranching became the primary industry here in the early 20th century. Whatever the venture, the livelihood of homesteading men and women demanded hard work and long hours, but families and friends helped each other, and also came together for fiestas. Early homesteader Juan Jose Sáenz built the house behind the group in this picture. He sold it to the Knipes in 1911. Their home had the only piano and cement floor in the area, and it hosted many community celebrations. Lito Benitez's guitar enlivened that 4th of July occasion. The cottonwood tree behind the Benitez and the peach orchard beyond were planted by Juan Jose Sáenz. By the mid-1920s, the way of the West was changing. Heavy grazing, drought, and mining operations contributed to erosion and the loss of grasses and other vegetation. On the slopes and valley floor below the Rincons, a generation of young Saguaro had been trampled. When Anglo-Americans from the east arrived, many homesteading families, who were strapped by droughts and a slumping economy, sold their ranches. In 1928, Jim Converse bought the Cebadilla Ranch from Rafael Carrillo. The Cebadilla became the Tanque Verde Guest Ranch. Here, visitors at a nearby guest ranch ham it up for the camera. At the same time, people in Tucson had begun to worry about the lack of young saguaros in the famed Eastern Stand. By the early 1930s, a movement to protect the saguaro forest had grown strong. It was championed by Homer Shantz, a botanist, avid amateur photographer, and president of the University of Arizona at the time. Shantz and others successfully campaigned with key politicians, and on March 1, 1933, U.S. President Herbert Hoover designated the Saguaro National Monument. Almost immediately, in the midst of the Great Depression, Saguaro National Monument, like other parks and monuments, provided relief for families across the country. In and around the Rincons, the Civilian Conservation Corps provided paid work for hundreds of young men from southern Arizona and neighboring states. The roster of those who worked here lists many familiar names: Conson, Carrillo, Castillo, León, Lopez, Martinez, Sáenz, and more. Between 1933 and 1941, men of the CCC removed road scars, cleared abandoned homesteads, filled 30 prospectors' holes, and put literally tons of rubbish from the area into the old Loma Verde mine shaft. They built check dams to prevent flooding and provide water for wildlife. They created 6 wilderness campgrounds and constructed the first visitor center. They also built the Loop Drive. Today, the park has been largely restored to its natural state, and young saguaro like this one are repopulating the land. Although no one lives in the park today, it belongs to everyone, and all Tucsonans can visit, hike, enjoy, and learn here with the guidance of park employees. Park rangers offer learning opportunities for young people, families, and groups who want to know more about how the land, wildlife, and people interact. They lead scheduled hikes and other activities on park grounds and often bring a bit of nature into the classrooms for our local schools. Park staff also manage the visitor center and recreation areas for people like us to enjoy, including picnic areas where families and friends can gather out of doors and trails for exploring the desert or mountains. At the park, we celebrate the nature and history of this vibrant land at the annual Fiesta de Saguaro. The fiesta brings us all together to celebrate, but you can come to the park anytime to reconnect to the land and its creatures. Throughout history, people have had strong ties to the land. Here in the park, those ties are still strong. We invite you to visit Saguaro National Park and remember those connections with our cultural past and with nature's beauty and bounty today. The desert is our natural and cultural legacy.